Well, hello everyone, and welcome to TWNow. We're glad to have you with us on our program today. Earth Day is held on April 22nd. It's held worldwide to celebrate the planet and to support its protection. Does the Earth, though, really need to be saved? Is our Earth really in danger from global warming, greenhouse gases, coal burning, nuclear reactors, oil drilling, and fracking? Do we really have a problem? Should we really care? What is our responsibility toward our planet, and what is our obligation toward God? This program will grapple with these issues and provide a sound-minded approach towards the topic of our part in the future of our planet. I'd like to introduce our guests for today. Today we have with us Mr. Dexter Wakefield, a regular guest on our program. So thank you for being with us today, Mr. Wakefield.
Glad to be here.
Also, Dr. Winnail. Dr. Douglas Winnail has written on the topic of environmental issues, and in particular, an article in the Tomorrow's World magazine titled, "How Will the Earth Be Restored?" So, again, welcome, Dr. Winnail.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And I should mention for all of our viewers, if you do like our program, make sure that you go ahead and subscribe and click like and all those things that we do on the social media. We're certainly glad to have you with us and share the program with your friends. So, to the question at hand, do we have a problem? Dr. Winnail.
You know, we look out our windows sometime, and if we can see a fence behind us and it comes through, we may not think we have a problem. And yet there was a study done in 1997 where about 1,700 scientists issued a dire warning, said our ecosystems are in danger. That was in 1997. 25 years later, 15,000 scientists said the trends are still in the wrong direction, and they concluded their report saying that human beings and the natural environment are on a collision course.
Is this a historic problem? In other words, okay, is this something that is just in recent years and we recognize this, or is this something that mankind struggles with in terms of caring for our Earth?
Well, you know, in the past, even if you go back to ancient times, you'll see situations where there was deforestation of large areas of the earth, where perhaps whole forests were cleared out for purposes of building or shipbuilding and things like that, particularly in the Middle East, in the early industrialization and when mankind started doing that. So we've seen that. We've seen the complete loss of wildlife in many parts of the Middle East and other parts of the world. So we can see the trend developing, and as populations increase and as economies increase, it's been accelerating in recent times.
So this is not a made-up problem when we talk about environmentalism or concern for the environment. It seems to be a human problem. Any other thoughts historically, Dr. Winnail?
You know, it seems like we don't get excited about anything until we see a big crisis developing. You know, I was teaching environmental courses back in the 60s and the 70s. And that was one of the things that drove it at that time, oil spills and things like. We were in California. There was an oil spill out there, and they were picking up dead birds and all kind of things like that. But those things kind of drove things. But you get back to the Romans in North Africa, other places, things were destroyed.
We were talking the other day in preparation for this, and we were talking about in the Bible how the cedars of Lebanon are referred to, where there are no cedars in Lebanon today, I guess. There are a few. Okay, they're not like they were in those days. So this seems to be, it's not something that's new in terms of man's impact on the earth. Okay, let's bring it forward. What about the very recent times? I mean, is it a concern? I mean, is it a true concern for people to worry about nuclear power and fracking and coal and this type of thing, or is it something that is only a problem for developing countries? How should we think about this today in terms of some of those issues?
You know, awareness of the problem is really a big issue, and it's something that I think in some of the more developed countries has gone along a whole lot faster than maybe in the undeveloped countries. Just want to mention something. Our viewers may be seeing the word, a particular word more and more. It's called externalities. It's a term that economists use, but in this context, it means the costs of production that are not covered by production. For instance, if you produce toxic waste in order to produce your particular product, you want to save the money for disposing of that, just dump it into a creek somewhere. And that was done for a long, long time. In our country, and in a lot of the Western or modern nations, we've had a lot more awareness of this problem as our industries have grown. But in the undeveloped world, they don't have the wealth to deal with these things. We're aware of it, we're doing more about it, but in other parts of the world it's not happening, and that's where much of the issue is arising now.
So the question then comes to mind is, should we be concerned? Should Christians be concerned? Should Christians care? Or is this sort of an external issue that has nothing to do with someone who would view themselves as a Christian? Dr. Winnail.
You know, Christians basically feel that they're following the Bible. The Bible contains an awful lot of information about how to take care of the environment. But I think today, a lot of people are being told, you know, God doesn't exist, or if he does, it's in your imagination. We evolved. So we're not looking at the earth as God's creation. God created the earth. He said it was good. The Bible says that the earth is the Lord's. If we're going to be Christians and follow biblical teachings, we need to approach the environment as God's creation, to take care of it and not exploit it.
So there is a Christian responsibility towards what God has created.
Just to add something to what Dr. Winnail said, he was right on point there. God created the earth. His creation is an extraordinarily beautiful thing when you go out and see the elegance and the beauty of what he's done. You could pray for eyes to see all of the things that he's done and how beautiful they are and how extraordinary his creation is. He loves this creation, and he would like for those who would have his character and his spirit to also see it as he does, to love it as he does. And I think that's a very important issue, a spiritual issue for God and for Christians everywhere, to love the creation and to want to maintain it and to dress it and keep it as God does.
You know, another dimension too, a lot of people feel as Christians we should just follow the New Testament. But we read in Revelation 18, verse 11, that when Christ returns, he's going to reward his saints, but he's going to destroy those who destroy the earth, which gives us some insight how God views what's happening today.
So then, following that thought, should we be involved in activism, environmental activism? So let's switch gears. Maybe I should break off and mention to our audience, if you have a question on this topic, frankly, in a topic we've covered in previous episodes, those questions, go ahead and fire up to us, and we'll try to handle them perhaps at the end of the program or in another program. But something specific on this topic, please go ahead and put them in the Facebook message box, and we'll try to address them as we go through the program. But back to the issue at hand now. So we're talking about Earth Day, and then I think we can agree that there's a problem and there's a Christian responsibility. But what about the Earth Day thing? I mean, should we be out there marching with signs or going and putting spikes in trees so trees will not be cut down? Or what is in the activism score? Are we on the right track to fix the problem?
Just to mention, in the Living Church of God, we deal with the spiritual aspects of these problems. We think the world's problems are spiritual, and as much as they try to do politically, whether they help or not, the underlying problems are what we want to deal with and expend our energy doing. On the other hand, what we as individuals do is another matter. That what God expects us to do, to not pollute, to do what we can ourselves, that would not necessarily be getting into political activity or political action with regard to these problems.
Does it help? I mean, does it help to march in the streets about issues? I mean, or what does it really even help?
Activism can help draw attention to the problem, but the causes of the problem run much deeper than that. Has to do with personal values, has to do with national values, national priorities. So it can help draw attention, but and it's helped to bring attention to some problems that we can pass legislation to bring about and to bring solutions like that.
You can think of any examples even over the past decades and here in our country, where there's been a change in values or perception.
I have a favorite. I lived out in Miami for a number of years, in South Florida for a long time, and a lot of environmental issues in Florida, as everyone knows. But I remember the Miami River, and it was bad. I mean, when I was back down there in the early 70s, it was a cesspool. It was terrible. Derelicts in it, garbage going in it, occasional body floating around. I mean, it was a very bad place. And since then, they've been cleaning it up. There's been a lot of activism about it. It's a beautiful area now. There's condominiums and houses and parks all around it, and yachts docked on as they go in and out. It's a beautiful area now. And that's just because there was awareness of the problem and a desire to do something about it. So there is a great deal we can do. I mean, we've seen mining now. They're required to fill in the great big holes that they make and to mitigate the disaster that they're doing. All of these, what we call externalities, they're saying, okay, you've got to pay for this now. You've got to put in your budget to pay for this, and they make regulations and laws that require that in the U.S. In other parts of the world, where the wealth and the will is not there, it's not the same. I'm not saying we're great, but the United States and Europe has been more of a leader in the matter.
So there's nothing wrong with becoming aware and even changing values in terms of pollution and even encouraging others. I mean, if somebody throws a can out the window or garbage out the window as they're driving along, to call them a litter bug is not a problem. In other words, we as far as being politically involved, that's one thing. But as far as actually encouraging those around us to conserve in these things, this is not something that because we believe in the return of Jesus Christ to make all things right. It's not wrong to try to do things for ourselves today. Are we on the same track here?
We're on the same track. I grew up in Ohio, near Youngstown, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Akron, and it was actually a river, the Cuyahoga River, actually caught on fire at one point because the steel mills were dumping all kind of things in the river. And again, with the legislation that's prevented some of those things, you provide financial incentives, you're going to get fined if this happens. So these things changed. These things changed. But again, we're dealing with why would people dump stuff in the river in the first place?
And why is that? What is at the core when people or companies do that type of thing?
Profit. Profit.
Well, cost reduction.
Cost reduction.
They're not paying for their externalities, and that's that word again. They don't. It costs a great deal of money to dispose of all of that, and so they go ahead and dump it. Now we have laws and so forth against it, and there's probably still a lot more to be done. But
is that not a Christian value then? When we talk about greed and selfishness, I mean, there's a Christian value of loving your neighbor, and this is a matter of Christianity, wouldn't you say? I get a bit exercised about this because
and loving God's world, the beauty of His world and everything. If we say, all of that's a really beautiful preserved area out there, and I'm going to fill it with all kind of nonsense and put a lot of stuff in it that shouldn't be there. Is that the mind of God? Is that the way He thinks? Is that His value? Or does He want to create in us the type of values and will that He has? And I think it's the latter is the answer.
There's also biblical principles, and I think it's in Deuteronomy where it talks about where to bury human waste. You don't dump it in a river. Remember, we walked around the walls around a medieval town in North Wales, and their privy was along the edge of the wall, must have been a 24-seater. And this was where the human waste went, and there was a water source right there. But this goes back to the 1300s. So the principle in the Bible was not being followed, and yet this was supposedly a Christian settlement.
I'll bet most people don't think that some of our let's say our laws and our values of cleanliness in our country are because of this Judeo-Christian heritage that we have inherited even culturally as a people. I have to say, I've been to parts of the world even in my lifetime where when you walk down a city street, there was literally a wall that men walked behind, and they urinated against the wall. And once every day, a big water truck would come up and would hose down that area, and as you said, it would hose it into the streets. Everyone stood there with their nose, holding their fingers to the nose quietly at the bus stop 30 feet up the road. But I think in our country, we don't appreciate what it's like in other parts of the world that don't enjoy some of the environmental safeguards that we put into place. So it's easy to point a finger and say, environmentalism or conserving or whatever, that's not important when we reap the benefits here in our country. Sorry, I got a little bit ahead of myself here. Dr. Winnail,
You're talking about a developing country. We saw the same thing in a city in Switzerland. We saw a bunch of guys at night standing talking, and then we saw the proprietors come around the next morning with a hose and washed everything down. This was a developed country. But they're not, again, Switzerland was involved in the Reformation.
Yeah.
So we got preachers that were not preaching some of the things they should have been, because that's Old Testament. We don't need to talk about that anymore. And yet those principles are there for using the environment wisely.
He's right on about that. And I guess you call that a Judeo-Christian ethic. A Judeo-Christian ethic is what underlies many of our laws and attitudes, and our approach towards public life is something that we got from English common law and developed along. But as we move away as a society from God and reject God, and the Bible is ridiculed now. We see people ridiculing Christianity and talking about marginalizing it and so forth. Christophobia is a national phenomenon these days. As we move away from that, we also move away from some of the core values. So that could become more of a problem in the U.S. I hope we'll stay on the course of the values you're talking about.
And these core values then determine our actions. And we change core values, our actions change.
Can we get to the point where we begin to worship the earth, and we begin to, in other words, the way we approach environmentalism becomes a worship as opposed to a proper care as God intended? It looks like you have a book in mind. So let's.
The book. This is an older book, but the principle here in the title says how to rescue the earth without worshiping nature. And these tree huggers that we talk about, they're going to chain themselves to a tree so that they can't cut the tree down. This is emotionalism. You know, there's a wise way to manage the earth, to harvest trees just like you harvest anything else. But when you harvest them, you got to replant. We've got to work with the laws of nature, not against it, and not break those laws of nature.
Taking on the mind of God as opposed to idolatry and that type of thing. And we're talking about godly values. And again, I hope someone who would consider themselves a Christian would not say, it doesn't matter, the environment doesn't matter because it's just all physical, but they would actually take care without becoming idolatrous.
But I think that the matter of, at least in some quarters, environmentalism has become a very spiritual thing. Don't forget that in the ancient world, God was a woman. The main god of many of the cultures there was a female deity. The goddess of the earth. They were agricultural societies, and she determined their goddess, their crops and all of what happened to them. We hear about Baal and Ashtoreth and the fertility gods and so forth. Well, some of this seems to be carrying over into Gaiaism, some of the worship of the earth. Now, there seems to be a spiritual void and a spiritual vacuum among many who have rejected the God of the Bible, but then it leaves an opening, an empty place, and they go out and they try to fill it with some of these really almost ancient ideas are popping back up again, and we're seeing this take on almost a religious and spiritual nature connected with some of the things that we're talking about. It doesn't have to solve the problems, but I think that's following up on what you were talking about.
This is partly due to some of the early environmental writers back in the 60s, a fellow by the name of Lynn White, basically blamed the environmental crisis on the Bible. Because in Genesis 1:28 it talks about God gave man dominion over the earth and he's to subdue it. Now the White and some of the other ones then picked up on this. This is the Bible's fault. He said our problem is religious. And until we change our religion, we're not going to solve the problem. But when you put down the Bible and then you start looking, well, if it's religious, what cultures have done a better job? And then you pull out the idea, well, they worship the earth, so maybe we should follow those principles. But you got to look at the whole picture. They were also exploiting the earth.
He also said, dress it and keep it.
Right.
Dress it and keep it, because it's his earth and his creation. So a man can subdue his environment, otherwise it will take over him, particularly if you live in the northern hemisphere or other places. So the other places, wild animals and things like that. But it's important for us to dress it and keep it, and to keep it as much as God made it as we can.
The principles, too, about dominion and subduing have to do with management. That we should be managing it as God would manage it. And if we use the principles in the Bible and would follow and be aware of environmental laws, then things would be different.
Let's follow up on that. In fact, that goes hand in glove with a question that we had from our audience. Here's the question. What are the ways we're going to clean it, that is the earth, clean it up after Christ's return? So let's take this in two steps. Let's first talk about the here and now. What do we have in God's instruction book about, let's say, environmentalism and taking care? What are some examples of some of the principles? We've actually touched on them up to this point, but let's do that, and then we'll talk about the future a little bit more.
In the Bible, we actually have an environmental ethic. We have guidelines in the Bible for managing the earth. As I just mentioned, Genesis 1:28 talks about subduing and have dominion. In other words, you manage the earth. You take care of it, like you would manage your home, like you would manage your garden. But there are principles on forestry. It talks about in Deuteronomy when you're besieging a city. We don't advocate military attacks or whatever. But it said now God inspired these things. When you besiege a city, you should not cut down the fruit trees because they're food. You can cut down other trees. It talks about if you find a bird's nest. Now, these are principles. You find a bird's nest, you can take the young, but you can't take the mother because the mother will lay more eggs. It would be the same thing in harvesting wildlife. You can take some, but you don't take everything. This whole idea today of industrial farming, industrial fishing, where you just go into an environment, you just take everything that's there. You're robbing, you're stealing from the environment.
What are some principles that the Bible brings to bear on farming? What are some other principles?
Just to add a little bit to what Dr. Winnail said, I think what he said is extremely important. We talk about the statutes in the Bible, and they are about this very specific things, but what you can do is look at the statutes and find God's values and his mind in them. In other words, what's important about this statute. For instance, the one about having a latrine when you're in the field, or not taking the eggs of a bird and letting the wildlife continue. What is the principle and where is the character of God in that statute? Take that principle and then apply it larger. That's magnifying the Word of God. But you have to look into what's here and find out about it. But there's far more that we can do with these things than just the main things you mentioned.
We also have the principle of the land Sabbath, where if you're farming, working with agriculture, you let portions of your land rest every 7 years. And one of the things that does, it restores variety. It also improves soil fertility. One of the problems today is soil compaction, where you drive these big, huge tractors and you squash everything down so you don't get any aeration. You let things go for a year, the root systems go down. These are all principles that are part of a biblical environmental ethic.
We talk about soil health, even the micronutrients that are able to be, I would say, renewed when the soil is allowed to lie without being open to the air. There's a lot of oxidation that goes on with micronutrients. Well, when it's rested, and frankly, some of the farming techniques today recognize that. I know some even talk about being more careful about tilling, but by and large, we live in a monoculture system that is more about the industrialization and greed, unfortunately. So we have some principles that we read in the Bible that make a great Bible study to go through all the principles that apply to caring for the earth, certainly for our audience, and we have some some writings in the Tomorrow's World about that, certainly. So we can refer you to more further study. Let's go to the future. What kind of world do you see when these principles are applied, when Jesus Christ returns to this earth and establishes his kingdom on the earth? How do you see the environment? How would you view that world?
We don't have to speculate. Isaiah 35 talks about when Christ returns, the earth is going to blossom like a rose. The desert is going to blossom like a rose. We lived in Phoenix for about 4 or 5 years, and there's a lot of desert. But every once in a while we had, once I think, a very wet spring, and all of a sudden there were flowers out there that was just grass, or just sand really before. But it says the desert's going to blossom like a rose. There's going to be streams in the wilderness. If you leave the hills forested and it rains, that water is going to be released very slowly. We flew into the island of Haiti a number of years ago. And looking down from the plane, I thought, there's something wrong down there. Because you see where rivers should be, but there's no water. And I found out they get rid of a lot of the, they chop down a lot of the wood on the hillsides to make charcoal. So they denude the hillsides. When it rains, the water runs down the river quickly and it's gone. We flew into the island of Jamaica a couple of days later. And all of a sudden there was water in the rivers, but there was also trees on the hillside. And if you manage the forests properly, there's going to be water in the rivers. So when things are run differently, this earth is going to change.
I would agree completely, and I think there'll be a change in attitude throughout the entire Holy Mountain of God. It's going to be a different approach and a different attitude that people are going to be doing. The problems of greed and so forth, what it will say, this is the way, walk ye in it. They will have righteous direction in many of these things. But also, I think, in addition to just the cause and effect practical things, we'll have God's blessing. Once they start doing that, God will bless it. He says, I will cause this to happen. I will cause that to happen. And I think we can look forward to many of those factors in the kingdom. And even I enjoy speculating about it a little bit too. It's fun to do.
Revelation 5:10 says that the saints are going to become kings and priests to reign on this earth with Jesus Christ. And I think we're going to have more than just biblical principles. For a number of years I taught a conservation course where we studied forestry, we studied range management, we studied wildlife management, we studied city planning. And there are biblical principles that when you combine that with a knowledge and an understanding of how the environment operates, those things are going to come together in the kingdom of God.
There's actually the question that your answer really actually went right to the heart of the question. Should environmental policy, by the way, thank you to our audience for giving some questions here. I'll just take one more here. Should environmental policy be guided by science? Well, as you said, science is studying and learning and accumulating knowledge that can be applied properly. So I think you basically gave the answer before the question. Okay.
I've taught conservation courses, I've taught health courses, science courses basically. And what was exciting to me was to find fundamental laws that agree with biblical principles. And if you only study the Bible and you don't study how God designed the earth to operate, then you're only using half of what we need to have.
Gives us principles and guidelines to the mind of God. Another
Just one thing I would ask everybody about this. You were talking about what's a Christian's role and a Christian's attitude towards these things. And ask yourself this question, a good thing to meditate on. As a Christian, do you care about what God cares about where the environment is concerned? And you can look in God's Word and find out what He cares about, exactly like you just said. Do you care about it? Do I care about it? And what is our role in doing all of these things? So ask ourselves that question, meditate on it, and see what you come up with.
I would say, it's great to march the streets on Earth Day, but really what's more important is how you live your life on a daily basis.
That's right.
It's great to be I would say actually it's only the tip of the iceberg to say and to call out slogans for environmentalism, but really what do we do in our daily life? That reflects our heart and mind. We just got a couple of minutes left, or about a minute here, so Could you give let's say, a summary statement of how someone who believes themselves to be living the Christian way of life, a biblically based way of life, how we would approach the environment? Just a summary statement, okay? I'll give each of you a chance to conclude here, okay?
I would suggest studying the biblical principles that apply to environmental management, and maybe take a course in conservation to learn some of these things. You know, I was in a press conference a number of years ago back in the 60s where they were going to bring down the U.S. government. And I talked to one of these young guys. I said, once you bring down the government, what's your plan? And he just looked at me. They didn't have any plan other than just make a lot of noise. I think we need to be preparing to reign on this earth to help restore the environment using biblical principles and also a knowledge of God's laws that He's designed to make the earth operate, to prepare.
Mr. Wakefield?
I would say two things. One, I would recommend to people do is to go out and look at God's creation and see it as well as you can. Look at the beauty of it, the birds, the way the trees are constructed, everything. The human body itself is fearfully and wonderfully made. Look at those things and try to see the elegance of God's mind in those things. And then, as Dr. Winnail was saying, look in God's Word, see what He says, but find the mind of God in it and see how He cares about His principles as expressed in His laws and statutes and judgments, in His commandments, statutes, and judgments in the Bible, and find ways to apply those things in your Christian life and in your relationships with other people.
Okay.
You know, we know a restoration is coming, Acts chapter 3, verses 17, 18, and 19. I'd like to ask our audience, what would you like to restore? What would you like to restore, and what is it going to take to restore these things? To become knowledgeable, to become useful, and then you'll be prepared.
Okay, well, thank you, gentlemen. Appreciate you being with me here today on the TWNow. And I hope that you've enjoyed the discussion in our audience. And I hope that we have accomplished here just for a few minutes our goal of adding insight and maybe a little bit of a challenge to your thinking and your daily life, of bringing the news events and items that are of concern in our daily life into perspective through really the words of the Bible and a godly way of thinking, a godly approach. Thanks for being with us here today, and we'll see you next time.